Thanks to all of you for coming, and a special thanks to those who are sitting in the adjoining room watching the video feed of this. I'm sorry they couldn't get in. This will be my second lecture in Stockholm. The first one was a few hours ago, so I'm still pretty fresh to this city. The title, I never actually gave this lecture a title. They've put "What is an object" here as the title for the entire event, but that's fine. I'll take that as my title here tonight as well. What is an object? Well, in the art world especially, there are certain connotations that the word object has, often referring to solid physical objects as opposed to performances or as opposed to conceptual art or as opposed to other things that aren't as physical as an art object is held to be. My sense of the term object is much broader than this. Being a philosopher, philosophers have to talk about everything. And so object is simply the term I use to refer to everything that in some way exists, including fictional and imaginary things. So for me, an object is not necessarily durable. It's not necessarily natural as opposed to artificial. It's not necessarily simple. An object for me is simply something that cannot be reduced in either of two directions. Reductionism actually happens in two directions. The kind that we normally talk about is the kind when you explain a thing by explaining the tiny pieces it's made of. This is what the sciences have taught us how to do very well. It's what the Pre-Socratic philosophers were also doing early on in the beginning of Western philosophy and science, telling us that everything's made of water, everything's made of air, everything's made of air, earth, fire, and water mixed together, and so forth. For me, that's not what objects are. Objects might also come in medium size or large size and still be objects. There's nothing privileged about the tiny layer of explanation. There are objects of all sizes in the cosmos. But there's another direction in which people reduce things, and that is the direction of reducing things upwards. Reducing things by saying objects aren't too shallow to be the truth, objects are too deep to be the truth. We don't need objects. We need simply relations or effects or language or power or perceptions, and there's no object hiding behind those. Everything's simply on the surface of the world rather than at the bottom. I will argue against both of those tonight. I will say that we need the concept of an object and that this concept of the object brings philosophy and the arts very close together. Arts and design, actually. Architecture is another area where I've been working more and more lately. All right, let me start with the third table. Since this is an essay some of you may have read, this is my contribution to the catalog at Documenta 3 years ago in Kassel. The third table refers to Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, the British physicist, who is probably best known, or surely best known, for his observations of an eclipse that helped verify Einstein's theory of general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, which involved a prediction that starlight, as it passes near the sun, should move. There should be a gravitational effect on the starlight, unlike in Newton's theory. Eddington's observations demonstrated that Einstein was right, and this was the moment when Einstein became a household name. He'd already been known for 14 or so years among scientists, but this was the moment when he became a public person everyone had heard of, the man who had overthrown Newton. Well, he's famous for that, Eddington, but he is also famous, or was famous for quite some time, for the beginning of his Gifford lectures, which philosophers used to talk about a lot. They don't talk about it so much anymore. At the beginning of these Gifford lectures in Scotland, Eddington said, "I'm sitting down to write my lecture at this table, but it's actually two tables." The first table is the scientific table. It's mostly empty space. It's made up of particles whirling around. It only seems solid. It's actually mostly empty space, and it's made up of these tiny particles and these tiny fields. And that's the real table for Eddington, since he's a physicist. But he says there's also a second table. The second table is the practical table, the table that's hard, that I can lean on, that I can move around my room, that has a specific price, that has a history, and so forth. And Eddington concedes that this second table also exists, and it's very hard to get rid of. But he, of course, as a physicist, is convinced that the first table is the more real one. But the two will always go hand in hand. We'll always be seeing double, the first and second table. It occurred to me as I was writing this essay for Documenta that neither of those tables is the real table. There's actually a third table in between the two that's the real table. And I think I can demonstrate this pretty easily. One way to demonstrate this is that a table, of course, needs particles to exist. I don't think any of us would think there can be an immaterial table that can separate from its physical substratum and float around by itself. I wouldn't argue for that. But obviously, you can remove a certain number of particles from the table. You can even remove a leg and replace it with another leg. You can change the color of the table and so forth. And yet it's still in some sense the same table. There's an emergence of the table over and above its tiniest components that make it up. You can't get rid of them all, but you can get rid of a lot of them. Someone told me once that the atoms in your body are recycled on average every 7 years. And so the last time I was in Stockholm, 2005, none of these atoms were here in my body. They were in food or somewhere else. You'd still call this the same body. It's aged 10 years since then, but it's still my body as it was in 2005. And so there's a sense in which this first table cannot account for the emergence of things over and above their ultimate components. And as Manuel de Landa has shown in his book, A New Philosophy of Society, a lot of times there are objects that can create their own parts or can replace their own parts. An example would be the city of Stockholm. I don't think it's ridiculous to say that in some sense this is the same city as the city of Gustavus Adolphus. No one is still here who was here then. There's one ship that we saw yesterday in the museum that may date from this time. It does date from this time. But it's not senseless to say that this is a different Stockholm every time someone is born or died, or every time a hair falls off somebody's head. This would be a very arbitrary philosophy where you're saying that Stockholm is nothing more than a nickname for all the positions of all the atoms at any given moment. Of course, that changes constantly. But there's still something about Stockholm that remains. All right, so that's the problem with the first table. What about the second table? Well, the problem with the second table, and saying that the table is a practical thing that has a certain position in the world at any given moment, is that I can move the table around. I can paint the table, I can sell it to somebody, I can move it to another continent, and it's still in some sense the same table. So the second table also does not get at the root of the issue. There's a third table in between those two. Only because there's a third table does the second table make any sense. Only because there's a third table that can be moved into different positions does it make sense to actually move it to different positions. A table is not what it is at any given moment. It's something more. It's a surplus beyond its current state in the world. You can move it around just like you can with any other object, and it's still the same object. Just as you can replace some of the atoms or even some of the pieces of the table, and it's still the same table. Well, what's so important about this is that I think we see a lot of philosophies today that are very geared towards a relational approach to the world. These philosophies are reacting against the old substance idea that there's simply hard physical objects out there and then we accidentally put them in certain positions. There's been a reaction against that to such an extreme that the relational view of philosophy has almost taken over. And if you look at contemporary continental philosophy, you're going to see a lot of people saying that individual objects are not primary, that there are individuating processes that come before that are primary, before the table. You're going to see Latour, Bruno Latour, my favorite living philosopher, who I nonetheless disagree with strongly on this point. Latour thinks a thing is nothing more than what it does. An object is whatever it transforms, modifies, perturbs, or creates for Latour. This is why he calls it an actor and not an object. What an object does is acts. Whereas for me, an object is always something more than any of its actions right now, because those actions can be changed, and it's still the same thing within certain limits. So this is what object-oriented philosophy is about. Object-oriented philosophy is about looking for third tables, or third electrons, or third musical instruments, or third cities. Whatever there is in a thing that is not reducible to its constituent components or to its effects. Now there's a problem with this, which is that all knowledge that we know of involves one of those two kinds of reductions. If somebody asks you to explain something, there are basically two possible kinds of answers you can give. You can tell them what it's made of, you can tell them what it does. Those are the two kinds of knowledge we have. Someone asks me what's a certain solution in the glass. I can say this is H2O, or I can say it's a thirst quencher. Those are the only two kinds of knowledge we have. Whereas I'm trying to say that the object itself, the water itself, is somewhere in between those two explanations. Those explanations are parasitical off of the water. And for this reason, in object-oriented philosophy, it turns out to be the case that philosophy is not a kind of knowledge. Philosophy is not a knowledge. Philosophy is something more than and less than a knowledge. Now, that's actually not such an original idea, because I would claim that this is what Socrates was talking about when he talked about philosophia. Philosophia, philosophy, means love of wisdom. It does not mean wisdom. It was the sophists who claimed to have wisdom. The sophists were the ones who took money to teach you what the truth of things was, and that truth was pretty minimal. The truth was that everything is true or that nothing is true, and therefore you should simply win arguments. This is what they would teach children to do. Whereas Socrates is the one who never gets knowledge about anything. Socrates is famous for asking the definitions of things in his conversations. It's often forgotten that he never reaches any definitions. No Platonic dialogue ends with an answer about what justice is, or what virtue is, or what friendship is, or what love is. These are always left hanging in the air. Any particular answer turns out to be inadequate. Another way of saying this is that you cannot paraphrase objects. This term comes from literary criticism of the 40s and 50s. The new critics in America were saying that a poem cannot be paraphrased. You cannot take a poem and say what its meaning is in prose terms. You cannot say what a metaphor means in prose terms, because none of those prose descriptions of the metaphor or the poem are ever going to fully, adequately express what is expressed in the metaphor itself. The same is true in the case of artworks. This is why I link the third table with a discussion of art in that essay. It's because you would never try to explain an artwork by explaining what it's made of, saying that the Kuhn's balloon dog upstairs is simply stainless steel, because there are a lot of things that are stainless steel, so it's not just that. Neither are you going to say that the balloon dog is how it makes me feel, or what it does to the market. It does those things too, but there's a little more to it than that. It challenges the first interpretation anyone has of it. And generally, the better an artwork is, the more it challenges your interpretation. The less easily paraphrasable it is, the more inexhaustible it is, so to speak. So, for me, there is not possible knowledge of objects. You can approach objects obliquely or indirectly. Metaphorical language is one of the ways that we do this. And this is what an object is. It's something we have to get at sideways. It's something that we can never replace. We can never translate it perfectly. Just as you can never translate Shakespeare perfectly into some other language, you can never translate an object perfectly into any language. An object is something more than anything that can be said about it or anything that can be done with it. And I think this actually cuts against the grain of a lot of contemporary philosophy that you can find right now. Let me give you another example here. Since my most recent book is on Bruno Latour's politics. It's called Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political. And I wrote a first book about Bruno Latour called Prince of Networks, where I try to develop the argument of his philosophy as being that everything is relational. There's nothing more to a thing than how it acts on other things. I was critical of that for some reasons, despite deeply appreciating Latour's work. And then when Pluto Press contacted me and said, who would you recommend to write a book on Latour's politics? And I raised my hand and said, I want to do it myself, because I didn't really know what Latour's politics were. Though I've been reading him for years and I'd written a whole book about him already, I never was sure what his politics were, because he scatters political remarks here and there throughout his writings, and then at other times it seems like he thinks everything's political. Anytime two actors interact, it's a political act. And so I wanted to figure out really what was going on in his politics. And what I found is that in his politics, I think he's closer to the truth than in his metaphysics. Latour's politics start off very heavily on one foot. That foot is the Hobbesian foot. Thomas Hobbes turns out to be one of the most important influences on Bruno Latour. Now, Hobbes has a very nasty reputation as a political philosopher because he thinks that the Leviathan, the state, has the right to crush resistance. But there are more liberal interpretations of Hobbes possible than that. In fact, some people call him the founder of liberalism for the very reason that he wants to prevent all violence within the Leviathan by giving the state a monopoly on violence. In Latour's case, what's important about Hobbes is that Hobbes did not allow any political transcendence. Nothing was allowed to transcend the polis. Hobbes, of course, was living during the time of a very bloody English Civil War, and he wanted to prevent this from ever happening again. And one of the things that was important to Hobbes is to say that there can never be a religious truth that one can appeal to outside of the state, beyond the state. Why? Because then all kinds of extremists will start appealing to a direct religious truth and using that to disobey the state. And so Hobbes did not want this. Hobbes wanted the religion under state control. Hobbes even wanted the state to be responsible for which miracles count as legitimate and which do not. So the state was going to rule on each and every miracle. Which one are you forced to believe as a citizen of this state? And you might, in your back of your mind, believe in some other miracle that the state had not sanctioned. But you're supposed to outwardly believe in the ones that the state has recommended as real miracles. Now that's one problem for Hobbes. He does not want any religious transcendence of the political sphere. Another one that's less famous is that Hobbes did not want any scientific transcendence of the political sphere. He did not want anyone claiming to have scientific truths that teach them that the government is wrong about this or that. So Hobbes surely would not have supported Galileo, for instance, in his conflict with the Catholic Church. Chapin and Schaeffer have written one of the classics of science and technology studies about the air pump that was invented by Robert Boyle. And there was a conflict between Boyle and Hobbes over this air pump. Boyle thought that he could actually produce a vacuum with this pump inside of a tube, and that he could have a certain number of trustworthy witnesses, of gentlemen bearing witness to this vacuum that had been created. And this was considered the dawning of the modern scientific article, Boyle's work on the air pump. Now, Hobbes, not only was he very suspicious of this, both because it produced this supposed immaterial thing called a vacuum. Hobbes is a materialist. He doesn't want to talk about immaterial entities such as vacuums. But it also was a kind of scientific truth that Boyle was appealing to that could contradict what the state says about things. And so Hobbes actually reported Boyle to the police for this. He put his money where his mouth is. He actually reported the great Boyle to the police over this, saying this is dangerous, he's conducting these experiments that might destabilize the state. Well, for Latour, Hobbes is very important for a similar reason. Latour also does not like any transcendent claims to truth. For Latour, truth is a matter of putting actors together and creating more and more convincing statements by putting together evidence from inanimate objects, evidence from humans. All these things go together in a stronger and stronger network, and this is what produces truth. Truth is not the reference to some objective thing existing outside the mind, but truth is a subspecies of force for Latour. Statements are either convincing or unconvincing. And this is the early Latour, who likes to talk like Hobbes, he likes to talk like Machiavelli. He says Machiavelli was actually great, there's no difference between might and right. And in fact, one of the reviewers of my book proposal, when I sent this proposal to Pluto Press, said they were glad I'm writing this book, but they don't think his politics will be that interesting. They think it's going to turn into might makes right. And I could understand that worry about Latour. And that is true of his early career, especially when he talks about politics. Latour does have a tendency to say there's no difference between might and right. He says that the political moralist makes a very sorry spectacle because there's no use in being right but failing to achieve victory. It's really a philosophy of victory, the early Latour, teaching you how to win. You're assembling as many black boxes as possible to try to attain victory over your opponents. And this is why scientific realists have never liked Latour, because it seems to be saying that truth is simply a matter of force or power, that no one can appeal to a truth outside of that power, and so on. That is what the early Latour looks like. However, something very important happens in We Have Never Been Modern, his major book published in 1991 in French. He talks there about Chapin and Schaeffer's book. And he suddenly starts realizing that, wait a minute, how can we deconstruct truth and not deconstruct power? Is power really as simple as they make it out to be? Chapin and Schaeffer end their book by saying Hobbes was right, because scientific discourse is simply a subspecies of social power discourse, right? Because the society sets the standards of what counts as good scientific work or not. And so therefore they think that Hobbes subsumes science underneath his politics. Latour says this can't possibly be true, right? That power is just as problematic as truth is. And this leads him off on a different direction, where Latour begins by saying, no, Hobbes was wrong. Hobbes is not right, that all truth can be reduced to power. Politics is not just about power. There is a truth involved in politics. We simply cannot access it. So he starts to sound more and more like Socrates. You can see this new route of Latour pass in the late 90s through his book Politics of Nature, whereas before he had no interest at all. He was a Hobbesian. He had no interest at all in any political truth that could challenge what society has said, what the state has said. In Politics of Nature, he adds two professions who have no other job than to do just that. They are the scientists and the moralists. What do the scientists and the moralists do in the Politics of Nature? Well, the scientists detect new entities that were not previously recognized by the polis. Climate change would be an obvious example of this. Our governments have not been taking account of this for centuries because they didn't know about it. And it was the scientists' job to warn us that this was happening, or that what was it when I was a kid? Fluorocarbons were destroying the ozone layer. These are things that the scientists are supposed to inform the state about for the middle period of Latour. So scientists do that, whereas moralists tell us about social groups that are being marginalized, the gypsies in France, or whatever group you want to think of that needs to be given more rights. So the middle Latour politics is all about detecting things that transcend the state, things that need to be recognized by the state and brought in. And even if they're rejected for now, we might bring them back later as part of the state. So for now, we're not really accepting animals' rights not to be killed. Maybe in the future, some state will decide that animals should have the same rights as humans. Who knows? Anything could happen centuries from now. But the point is, these are things that transcend the polis as it's currently constituted. Now, where does this lead Latour politically? This leads him, at least in the early 21st century, to taking Lippmann and Dewey very seriously. And Lippmann and Dewey are not often regarded as major political philosophers, but Latour, under the influence of his Dutch student Noortje Morris, started taking these two figures very seriously. Walter Lippmann is mostly forgotten today, but in his time, in the 20s and 30s, he was probably the world's most famous journalist. He met with kings, and he was the confidant of celebrities. And Lippmann wrote a rather cynical book about American democracy. American democracy was supposed to be about educating its citizens so the citizens can rule themselves and so forth. And we see how that's worked. It's not worked very well. The public is often quite ignorant of these issues. Demagogues easily manipulate the American public and so forth. Lippmann was worried that America was going to slowly turn into a technocracy, and he really saw no other alternative in certain periods of his career to this, because the public cannot possibly stay informed about all these issues. Now, John Dewey read these thoughts from Lippmann and took them seriously, but drew the exact opposite conclusion from them. Very interesting conclusion. Dewey said, yes, this happens, but it's nothing to bemoan. It's just the way things work. Not everybody can stay informed about all issues at all times. Even Walter Lippmann, the most educated journalist of his day, could not possibly have opinions on every tiniest political issue. Some of them very local issues that were of no interest to him. So Latour talks in his new book, Modes of Existence, an inquiry into modes of existence, about object-oriented politics. And he did actually steal that term from me, darn him, because he heard me introduce that term in 1999 in London. Now he's talking about object-oriented democracy, object-oriented politics. What he means is that every issue or every object defines its own public. There is not a constant group called the public that has to be informed about everything. We all kind of duck in and out of the political sphere as issues arise that concern us or don't concern us or bore us or interest us. And this is what democracy is about. It's not demanding constant self-education and constant presence on every political issue, but it means that we dive in where things are of concern to us. And this, for Latour, is what object-oriented democracy is about. It's about the fact that the object of politics is never going to be entirely clear what it is. All the various stakeholders in the issue come around and have a debate about it and reach a settlement about it that tries to satisfy all the relevant parties. And then that public disappears, and another public emerges for another issue, and so forth. So this is where Latour was politically, for sure, say 10 years ago. Now, my sense is that he might be drifting back in the Hobbesian direction in the last few years. The reason for this is that if you read his Gifford lectures about the environment, about climate change, he seems to be drifting in the direction of Carl Schmitt, who is another one of those reactionary figures often mentioned in the same breath as Hobbes or Machiavelli. Schmitt, of course, thinks the political proper happens only when all question of right and wrong is out the window because we've reached a state of exception where the question is existential survival. So let me give you an example from Egypt. Something that's going to happen in Egypt over the next 15 or 20 years. Forget about Egypt and tensions with Israel. That's not going to be Egypt's political problem. Egypt's political problem is going to be water. This is a very heavily desert country with growing population. They're going to have big water problems. And they have a dam. They built a dam in the 1950s, the Aswanhai Dam, which dams up the Nile into a big lake. And this is where they get their water from. And from the 1970s, under Sadat, it was stated Egyptian policy, stated Egyptian foreign policy, that we will bomb any dam constructed by another country on the Nile. And their argument defending this is that we have a treaty that we signed. All these countries in Africa signed a treaty in the late 40s, I think it was, specifying which countries receive which percentage of the Nile water. And they're supposed to stick to this. Well, in recent years, the sub-Saharan African countries on the Nile have grown to resent this. And one of the reasons they resent it is that this treaty was signed under British colonialism, and so they say, therefore, we are absolved of obeying this. This was not we, the people of sub-Saharan Africa, speaking in our own name. This was an arrangement by the British Empire. We don't feel bound by it at all. And then Egypt answers, yes, but you guys have rain. We don't have any rain. The Nile is the only water we have, and a few oases. And the sub-Saharan African countries answer, yes, but you guys waste a lot of your water. You don't have very efficient irrigation practices. You need to improve your efficiency with the water you have before you start demanding a higher share of it. And Egypt responds that you're also very inefficient at your irrigation practices, so don't point the finger at us. And this goes on. And what's interesting about this issue to me is it's very hard to tell who's right if you study this issue. It's very hard to reach a moral conclusion about this water issue in Africa. And it's going to be impossible for anybody to reach a moral solution or a moral compromise because at some point it's going to be a question of life or death for multiple countries. And when things get to that point, we have war generally, where people don't see any alternative other than armed conflict to solving the resource question. So this is the kind of situation Schmitt at his best would illuminate. Schmitt would say that you have this kind of this state of exception when you cannot appeal to questions of right or wrong, and it's simply a question of survival. Interestingly, Schmitt, despite being a Nazi, often claims that liberals are worse because liberals have to define their enemies as morally evil. They have to define their enemy as Hitler or as Saddam Hussein or somebody who seems completely evil, as portrayed in the media of the liberal countries. Whereas Schmitt says, at least I'm just saying we have to defeat the enemy. We don't have to destroy the enemy as an immoral evil. It's simply a practical matter of we have to defend ourselves. Anyway, Schmitt is generally regarded as a sinister figure. He's popular often on the left, however, because he is honest, in their opinion, about politics being a form of violence. And of course, what the left often doesn't like about liberals is what they see as a hypocrisy about the question of violence, the fact that violence is used to constitute the state. Now, what is pushing Latour back towards Schmitt is the question of climate change. In his Gifford lectures, Latour takes this very interesting line that I call green Schmittianism. I've never seen anything like it. He's saying we've reached the point where we have to stop debating with the climate change skeptics. We have to simply declare war on them and beat them. I don't think he means physically killing them, but he does mean simply defeat them any way possible, because there's enough evidence there to convince us that the climate change is happening. We're never going to reach total direct scientific certainty, just as Socrates cannot reach direct scientific certainty, but there comes a point when you have to act. And this is why Schmitt is so important politically for Latour. So he seems to be drifting back into that power direction of politics after his decade-long object-oriented period, where he was talking about political issues as hidden things that we all have to debate about. All right. So I've talked a bit about why I think philosophy and arts are natural allies. Philosophy since the 1600s has been trying to mimic the conditions of the natural sciences and of deductive geometry. I would agree with Alfred North Whitehead that it's a very bad idea to model philosophy after deductive geometry, because philosophy, as Whitehead puts it, is a form of descriptive generalization. Philosophy is not about finding some unshakable first truth and then deducing other truths from it. Deduction is not actually a very common procedure in philosophy when it works well. As Whitehead also puts it, philosophies are never refuted, they're simply abandoned. A philosophy doesn't die because someone comes up with knockdown arguments against it. Philosophies generally die because they come to seem too narrow, they seem to have too many arbitrary assumptions, they don't seem to describe the world as we know it very well. An example that Whitehead gives is that what's the problem with Aristotle and Plato? They didn't know about the cell theory of biology. For them, living things were automatically units, and there was no problem of understanding how a living thing was made up of multiple units, such as cells and organs. And so he thinks that this is why Plato and Aristotle become somewhat out of date, not because someone refuted them. Someone could come up with 20 arguments against Plato. Plato is still more interesting than 99% of philosophers working today or at any time. So philosophy and arts, I think, go naturally together because I mentioned that the arts do not really paraphrase objects. The arts create objects, but you cannot replace an artwork with any description of it. An artwork is something unified. It's something that you cannot replace by a prose description. And there are other cases like this. Wine tasting is an example I often use because Daniel Dennett, who's a fairly reductive American philosopher, makes fun of wine tasting. He talks about a wine taster, maybe fictional, who says a flamboyant and velvety Pinot but lacking in stamina. And Dennett basically says, isn't that pretentious? That's ridiculous. You should just do a chemical analysis of the wine. That's real wine tasting. Okay, fine, you need the chemical analysis. But there's also a sensory analysis. There's something happening with the human experience of wine that demands this kind of indirect poetic language to get at what the flavor is. And yes, that can be pretentious, but pretension is simply the professional risk that we run in the humanities and the arts. Because we have to describe things using indirect language. So we shouldn't be ashamed of this. We should be willing to run the risk of pretension. You're not going to find a pretentious scientist in most cases. You might find a narrow-minded scientist, a dogmatic scientist. You're never going to find a pretentious scientist. Why not? Because what do scientists do for a living? They replace names of objects with prose descriptions of those objects by way of experiments and other techniques. The name electron is gradually replaced with a list of all the true facts about electrons until finally maybe you have them all, or maybe a few are left mysterious. That's not what you do in the arts. You don't try to replace a Picasso painting gradually with truer and truer descriptions of the painting. That's never going to happen. The critic, the art critic, the architecture critic, the food critic, the wine critic, the philosopher are always going to be moving around on the outside of the thing, trying to give descriptions of it indirectly. All right, let me move on to philosophy now a bit and talk about what my background is here. Is that clock correct? I have 20 more minutes? Or do I have more than that? Okay, all right. I made it sound in the first step as though all philosophers and scientists were very anti-object, right? Because they were either reducing things downward to particles or they were reducing things upward to their effects. In fact, there have been some object-oriented schools in the history of philosophy. I don't think any of them have gone far enough. The first school we have to mention will be Aristotle and Leibniz, much later, disciple of Aristotle, centuries later. What characterizes Aristotle is Aristotle was probably the first philosopher in the West to take individual things as being the primary substances the world is made of. So it's not water, it's not atoms, it's horses and plants and things like this. Humans, these are the primary substances for Aristotle. Leibniz did this as well. The difference being that for Aristotle, these substances can be destroyed. He didn't believe in the immortality of these substances. Horses can be killed, people can die, plants can die. Whereas for Leibniz, any living thing that died, its monad would continue to float around in the world. Human souls, in particular, are immortal for Leibniz, as a good Christian. Well, the problem with this kind of thinking about substance, as I see it, is that they were very focused on natural things. What is natural is the real object. So it's plant and animal species, for the most part, that are real, or plant and animal individuals that are real, for the most part. Water and things like this as well. Natural kinds, as they're somehow called, things that occur in nature as specific types of objects. And this makes it impossible for someone like Aristotle to help us much in contemporary social theory or contemporary art theory, where usually we are not dealing with natural things. We're dealing with artificial things. We're dealing with machines. We're dealing with international institutions, with political entities. And I'm about to challenge myself to write a book on the Dutch East India Company, because the Dutch East India Company is Leibniz's favorite example of a ridiculous object that can't possibly be a real object, right? Because it has many different people, many different ships, many different offices. The exact boundaries of the Dutch East India Company and its powers are changing over time. I'm going to argue the opposite, that the Dutch East India Company is a real thing. that endures for a certain period of time. It's not immortal, but it can add and subtract elements and still remain the same company within certain limits. There is also Immanuel Kant, and since philosophy moves so slowly, Kant is still our living grandfather. He published Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, but for the most part, we're all still working in Kant's shadow because of how slowly philosophy moves. Now, for Kant, of course, a big part of his philosophy is that there are the things in themselves which lie outside the human mind. We can think about them, but we can never know them. Why? Because we are trapped in space and time, which we know are humans experience everything in space and time. This does not prove that there are really space and time outside the human mind. Also, there are 12 categories of the understanding for Kant, things like cause and effect. We don't really know if things happen according to cause and effect outside the mind because we can never get outside the human mind. So Kant does talk about objects, and he talks, as I do, about objects as being impenetrable to any direct form of knowledge, any form of paraphrase. The problem for me with Kant is that he restricts this to being simply a human problem. That we poor humans have this major difficulty that we cannot reach the things in themselves. Poor us, we are tragic, finite creatures. What about objects interacting with each other? Objects interacting with each other also do not make contact with the full totality of each other. When fire burns cotton, the fire does not make contact with all the properties of the cotton. The fire is relatively stupid, just as humans are. Humans look at a cotton ball, we hold it in our hands. We are not making contact with all features of the cotton ball. When fire burns the cotton ball, well, the fire may not be alive as we are. The fire may not be conscious as we are. But the fire is still only touching certain features of the cotton, the ones that are relevant to its own existence. So objects distort each other as well. Objects translate each other as well. It's not just humans that do this. The difference between humans and fire, that's another question. That's not a fundamental ontological question. Ontologically speaking, the most basic level, every object distorts or translates every other object it encounters. This is a general problem throughout all of philosophy. And this idea comes out of Islamic philosophy, from a fairly conservative brand of it, from fairly early on in Islam, the so-called Ash'arites in southern Iraq, in Basra. All monotheist philosophers, of course, had said that God is the only creator. The Ash'arites took it a step further by saying God is the only causal agent at all, and it's blasphemous to say otherwise. There's a certain passage in the Quran about the Battle of Badr where the Muslims defeated the infidels at Medina against all odds. And there's a saying in the Quran that says something like, you think you threw the stone, but in fact it was Allah who threw the stone. Now, of course, the obvious way to interpret that is that this battle was miraculous. It was divine intervention. Allah intervened in this battle so the Muslims would survive. These Ash'arites, however, took it in a much broader sense to mean that not just the stones being thrown at that particular battle, but my picking up the water glass. I think I am picking up the water glass, but in fact it is Allah who is picking up the water glass. God intervenes in every causal interaction in the cosmos. Well, this took a long time to pass into Europe, and it passed into Europe through a famous Stockholm resident named René Descartes, the unfortunate man who died here, and was once buried here, I was told, before he was relocated. His bones were relocated to Paris. For Descartes, of course, the two finite substances are the mind and the body, and since those are different substances, it's hard to know how they can communicate, and so God, as the infinite substance, is brought in to bridge the gap. His intellectual heir, Nicolas Malebranche, pushed that even further, going back to the Arab idea that even object-object interactions, God is intervening in those as well. It's not just the mind-body interaction, but any two objects interacting, God has to come in. And then, of course, you had other philosophers in the 17th century, such as Leibniz, Spinoza, and Berkeley, all of them bringing God in some way in order to explain causal relation between different things. Now, this may sound quaint to us today. We may sound, this was what philosophers used to think back when they were religious, and isn't it great that we got rid of a religion now and we're more secular? Except that the same idea still exists in Western philosophy to this very day. It's simply not God anymore. It's the human mind. Philosophers who are still contemporary for us include Hume and Kant. And what do Hume and Kant tell us about cause and effects? Hume tells us cause and effect is simply a habit. Every time somebody puts their hand on a fire, it seems to hurt, so therefore there's a very high probability that the fire is causing the hurts, even though we can't prove it. It's the same idea as the occasionalist. It's just saying that the human mind must be on the scene every time a supposed causal event occurs. The human mind is what forms all the habits that lead us to think there's cause and effect. Immanuel Kant is even easier to prove this point because Kant thinks cause and effect is explicitly a category of our understanding. So it's the human mind that makes cause and effect happen. It's nothing outside in the world. An interesting thing happened here in the 20th century on this question of occasionalism, as we call it in philosophy, occasionalism being the idea that God is intervening everywhere. And I told you that Hume and Kant replaced God with the human mind. The human mind is always there as the glue for any causal relation. Alfred North Whitehead brought back God as the universal glue, which is a very daring and even crazy move to make in the 1920s. Very late for that move. It sounds like a 17th century sort of idea. Whitehead's idea is that I see a lilac-colored sweater here. Actually, that sweater has all the colors of the rainbow, and God can see that when God looks at this sweater. But I, being a stupid human, am objectifying it into this one color. I'm passing through gods, through the eternal object, lilac-colored, and objectifying the shirt in terms of that color. All right. Then there's Bruno Latour, who is actually probably even more religious than Whitehead was. Latour is a very serious practicing Catholic, and Latour, however, doesn't usually bring God into his philosophical arguments the way Whitehead does. And Latour tries to give a more secular version of occasionalism, where Latour gives the example of Frédéric Joliot and the atomic bomb. Frédéric Joliot was the son-in-law of the Curies. He and his wife, the Curie's daughter, both won Nobel Prizes of their own later. But for Latour's story, the important thing is that Joliot was the first person in France to link politics with neutrons. Neutrons were discovered, I used to say 1929, but I think it was 1932. I think I was wrong saying 29. Anyway, James Chadwick in England discovered the neutron. And of course, when it was first discovered, it seemed completely apolitical. Who could think that there's any political value in the neutron? None. But then just a few years later, it was determined that neutrons were extremely valuable in splitting the atom. And so neutrons became an extremely political object. And Joliot tried very unsuccessfully to persuade the French Ministry of Defense to invest heavily in this project, atomic bomb project. They weren't able to make much progress on it before they were out of the war. But Latour takes this as a paradigm case of what causation is all about. Latour says no two things can relate unless there's a third term relating them in between, no matter what example you take. There's a problem with this, however. The problem is if Joliot is what bridges politics and neutrons and makes them touch, how can Joliot touch politics and how can Joliot touch neutrons? The same problem occurs there. And you can say, okay, Joliot touches neutrons through a scientific instrument. Okay, how does he touch the scientific instrument? Through his eyeball. How does Joliot touch his eyeball? Through his nervous system. How does Joliot touch his nervous system? Through his brain. You can probably keep going back, regressing further and further, and you're going to push the problem further and further back, the same problem. Latour's answer to this is a very disappointing pragmatic answer, which is simply you stop when it gets boring, which may work for the purposes of sociological analysis. It doesn't work for the purposes of philosophy, of metaphysics. You have to be able to explain, for the purposes of metaphysics, how any two things can touch at all. The reason Latour can never explain this, I hold, is because he only has one kind of object. He has a completely flat ontology. All objects are actors. So they come in only one kind. And so anytime you have two actors together, there has to be a third one in between the two, and it goes on as an infinite regress. So the only solution we can have is to have two different kinds of objects. Otherwise, we get something like Zeno's paradox. How do you get outside the door of this outside of this auditorium? You can't, because first I have to go halfway to the door, and once I'm there, I have to go halfway the distance between there and the door, and once I'm there, I have to go again halfway the distance, and so you're going to get closer and closer to the door, but never get outside of the auditorium. This obviously this can't explain how anything interacts if this is the way things work. I'm going to tell you now why I think there are exactly two kinds of objects. Just as there are exactly two poles of magnets, north and south, and this is why you can make a chain of magnets. You don't try to touch north and north pole together, they'll repel. But if you have two kinds of objects, you can connect an infinite number of objects in sequence, and that's what I think is needed. I need to talk here about phenomenology again. And then I'll end with some thoughts about art. The transition is easier than it sounds. Let's talk about Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, who can be grouped generally under the heading phenomenology. This is my favorite object-oriented brand of philosophy. Most people don't usually see it as object-oriented. I think it's the key to both of these thinkers. Let's start briefly with Husserl in an unfair way, and then we'll come back to him in a fair way later. One of the things, Husserl, of course, is the founder of phenomenology. Phenomenology was founded in his logical investigations in 1900-1901, after 12 years of suffering, in which Husserl sometimes doubted whether he had any philosophical ability at all. Became a groundbreaking work. And one of the key principles of phenomenology is that we should simply describe things as they appear to us as a first step. Do not invent theories about unseen things. What he's doing there is trying to prevent the sciences from trying to take over philosophy, as they seem to be doing in the late 1800s, and as they're doing again now with neurophilosophy, trying to replace us with neuroscience, some of them. Husserl said that the problem with scientific theories is not that they're false, they're probably true. The problem with scientific theories is that they are mediated. They are not directly what we see. So when you hear a door slam, don't immediately jump ahead to the theory of how you're hearing that sound. Don't say, well, it's because sound waves are going through the air, vibrating my eardrum, going up my nervous system, creating a chemical pattern in my brain, and so forth. This is probably true, but it's not the first thing we experience. The first thing we experience is simply the slamming of the door. Even if I'm not looking at the door, I say, that's a door slamming, and I turn around and, yes, it's a door. There are all these psychological subtleties in our experience of that door slamming that Husserl invites us to describe in very painstaking detail until we finally reach the essence of what does that sound really have as its core that makes it the sound of a door slamming? How could we vary it without changing the fact that it's the sound of a door slamming? Well, more about Husserl in a bit, but Heidegger's criticism of this. Heidegger, of course, was Husserl's star student, but as early as his lecture courses in 1919, when he was 29 years old, Heidegger argued that this is not the primary way we encounter things. The primary way we encounter things is in taking them for granted and not having them consciously in mind. So the floor in this room, that's the most important thing in this room. If the floor were to disappear, we'd all fall and become dead or seriously injured. But you weren't thinking about the floor, most likely, until I mentioned it. You weren't thinking about the oxygen in the room until I mentioned it, but we all need it here to survive. There's this entire vast background of things that we need. Political stability in the streets of Stockholm. You know, if it were like Egypt's Tahrir Square out there, we wouldn't be able to sit here comfortably listening to a lecture. There are all these background things we take for granted. And as Heidegger argues, we normally notice these things only when they malfunction in some way. You don't normally think of a bodily organ that you have until it starts having a pain or a medical complication. And you don't normally think of solid ground until there's an earthquake and so forth. So for Heidegger, the deeper level is this hidden layer, this hidden background that only erupts occasionally, usually in cases of malfunction. And Heidegger has a tendency to treat this entire background region as though it were one unified being, one unified lump. I think that was his mistake. His mistake was in not accounting sufficiently for the fact that each object has its own background. Someone who does this very well, however, is Marshall McLuhan, of all people, great Canadian media theorist, who says that every medium has a background and the background is what's most important about it. So the television shows, whether the television show is good or bad is not especially important to McLuhan. The important thing is that you're watching television, not listening to the radio. And that has certain consequences for how your brain organizes the world. And television is what he calls a cold medium, not a hot medium, and so it's more hypnotic, and there's all these other features of the background medium. For McLuhan and Heidegger, then, they are theorists of the backgrounds. They think the foreground is superficial. You don't need to care so much about how things appear. And so Heidegger, in this way, is trying to turn phenomenology upside down. And he gets what I would call real objects. Real objects are the ones that withdraw, that never become visible even when they break. If I'm using a hammer and it breaks, I become conscious of the hammer, but there's still more depth in that hammer that I cannot exhaust. The hammer is always deeper than any interaction we have with it. Not just that praxis is deeper than theory, but that the hammer as an object is deeper than any human interaction with it whatsoever. And ultimately, the interaction between any two objects, whether they're human or not, two asteroids colliding in distant space, the same thing happens there. They're not fully grasping each other. There's more depth in each of those asteroids than either of the asteroids can react to. All right, so that's Heidegger. But now we need to go back to Husserl because we were unfair to him a few minutes ago. What is really the chief insight of Husserl? I would say that it's this, and you're not going to find this anywhere in the Husserl scholarship. For me, it's that Husserl reversed British empiricism. One of the primary lessons of British empiricism in figures such as Locke and Hume is that there isn't really an object. There are no such thing as objects. There are bundles of qualities. So you think you're holding an apple in your hands. You're actually holding a bundle of qualities in your hand. You're holding red, round, juicy, hard, sweet, cold. And all these things appear together so often in your hands that you start giving them all a nickname. I'll call this apple. Even though I never see an apple, I just see these qualities. That is what empiricism thinks about objects. They're not really there. It's just a loose nickname for a bunch of qualities that come together over and over again repetitively. In a way, the key insight of phenomenology is to reverse that idea and to say that the object comes first, the qualities come second. And so Husserl gives some good examples of this in the Logical Investigations. He says, you see your friend Hans walking down the street. Well, I say there's my friend Hans. He looks a little more depressed today. He's wearing different clothes. He had a haircut since I saw him yesterday. You're not going to say this visual image that I see approaching me is 97.3% similar to the person yesterday I called my friend Hans, and therefore I will arbitrarily say the family resemblances are such that, no, that never happens. That's a complete construction on the part of empiricism. That's not how it works. What happens is you say, I see my friend Hans, his qualities are a bit different. Now I'm walking from behind and seeing him from behind. It's still Hans, I'm just seeing a different side of him. And so the object comes first for phenomenology, not the qualities. The qualities are subservient to the object for phenomenology. And Merleau-Ponty, being the most beautiful writer of these people, gives the best examples. He says somewhere that the black of an ink pen and the black of an executioner's hood are not the same black, even if the wavelength of light is exactly the same, right? Because the object in question infects the color with its own atmosphere, right? So if you're going to be scared by the black of an executioner's hood, you're not going to be scared by the black of an ink pen, even if it's the same black, because the object comes first. So this is an important discovery of Husserl that Heidegger and others completely ignore. And that's this idea that even though Husserl is an idealist, even though Husserl thinks there's no such thing as a world of things in themselves outside of possible human perception, he still retains a concept of objects in tension with their qualities. Objects are in tensions with qualities because you can change your clothing, you can change your appearance, and I still will recognize you within certain limits as the same person. So there's one tension here between objects and qualities, and whereas most philosophies exist in order to collapse distinctions and break them down, object-oriented philosophy is about driving wedges between those distinctions. And there's four basic distinctions, because you have real objects, the kind that Heidegger talks about that always hides. Those real objects need real qualities, because if all objects had the same qualities, they'd all be the same. So for objects to be different, each one has their own real qualities that are hidden from us. We can never paraphrase them. But then on the level that I call the sensual level, there are also objects and qualities in tension with each other. And so you actually have four tensions involved. And for me, these are the basic facts of philosophy, these four tensions. And if you look at them, you're going to end up with what I call time, space, essence, and eidos in my book, The Quadruple Object. Again, time, space, essence, and eidos. I think time and space can be explained in terms of tensions between objects and their qualities. And usually time and space are talked about together as these peerless dimensions of the universe. But I think essence and eidos, which are different kinds of tension between objects and their qualities, also belong in the same breath. And so that really time and space should be spoken of more fundamentally in terms of tension between objects and their own qualities. And the one that's of interest to us here is the tension between real objects and their hidden real objects and their visible qualities, because I think this is the one that is relevant to arts. And here I'm borrowing from Heidegger's essay on the origin of the work of art, right? Because Heidegger talks about artworks being a strife between earth and worlds. The earth is what withdraws and hides, and world in that essay is what's visible. And this is the tension. The artwork is visible, but it's also not visible. What it makes present is not ever quite there, which is a way of saying what I said earlier, that artworks are not paraphrasable. You cannot translate artworks into presence in any way. So I would agree with Heidegger on the basic idea, except that I think Heidegger's earth, again, is too unified. It's too much a single background that all things share, whereas I think that each object has its own backgrounds. Now, here's the art transition, because this flaw in Heidegger's model of the background is quite similar to Clement Greenberg's problem when he talks about the flat background canvas in painting. And I know that Greenberg maybe isn't fully back in fashion yet. He was the only person whose name brought hisses from the crowd in Berlin when I spoke it 3 years ago at Transmediale. People were actually hissing. Very unpopular in those circles. But Clement Greenberg, of course, exerted lots of influence in the 1940s, 1950s, up to the early 60s. The power to make and break careers, the power to dub Jackson Pollock, the great new artist. On the one hand, the object-oriented philosophy I've talked about seems to be in some agreement with Greenberg, right? Because object-oriented philosophy also talks about the autonomy of objects. And Greenberg talks also about the autonomy of artworks from their biographical and social-political surroundings. There's a certain self-containedness or autonomy to artworks. However, I think he draws the wrong conclusions from this. And I'll give a few examples. I mean, we know how harsh Greenberg could be. He, of course, has no interest for either Dada or Surrealism. He thinks for the same reason, but I would say for opposite reasons. Greenberg, although he's famous for attacking kitsch in his first published essay, I think his real strategic enemy is academic arts, as he calls it. Now, what is academic arts? There are a lot of ways to define this. We all know what late 19th century French academic painting looks like, and we can see why he wouldn't like that. But he defines academic arts in a way that would have pleased Marshall McLuhan towards the end of his career. Greenberg says in a famous lecture in Australia that academic art is art that is unaware of its medium. So a good example of academic art would be art that continues simply to paint three-dimensional objects arranged in a three-dimensional space that we're looking out a window and looking at them as we've had ever since the Italian Renaissance. He thinks of this as academic arts, and he considers Salvador Dali to be simply a regressive example of this, right? Because even though Dali paints all these crazy figures in his paintings, he's still trying to paint a three-dimensional likeness of something you might see looking out a window. And so Greenberg admits that Dali needs to do this. Dali needs to retain the medium as it was in academic painting in order to draw our attention to the strange variations in content, such as tall flaming giraffes and William Tell with the crutch under his giant buttock, as you can see upstairs here. So he doesn't like Dali, but he admits that Dali had to do this in order to stay, in order to draw our attention repeatedly to the variations in the content instead of the medium. And you can do a thought experiment. You can try to imagine a Dali painting done in the style of analytic cubism. It's impossible to make that work, I think. It would be simply too intellectually busy. I love the Dali painting, The Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can also be used as a table, where Vermeer appears as a ghost and he has this very long table with a tray of drinks on it. It's a very amusing one. But try imagining painting this like Picasso and Braque during the high analytic cubist period. It would simply be too confusing. Cubist paintings need simple banal objects, right? They need violins and candlesticks because the formal variations are already such a demand on the intellect that you need very simple objects to be depicted. And vice versa with Dali's images. You need a very traditional medium depicting them so that the objects themselves aren't too confusing, so that you can see that it really is a flaming giraffe, it really is the ghost of Vermeer, and so forth. Nonetheless, I can see why Greenberg would call Dali an academic artist. I cannot so easily see why he calls Duchamp an academic artist. Because if there was anyone who did not take his medium for granted, it was probably Duchamp. The medium of art is always being challenged in the ready-mades and elsewhere. And so in a sense, although surrealism and Dada are always lumped together as a package, and you can see why, because they both have a similar sense of humor and a lot of people belong on both sides of the fence, but there's a sense in which surrealism and Dada are doing opposite experiments. Opposite thought experiments. One of them is retaining the old medium and varying the content. The other is doing the reverse. Okay, so that's one example of Greenberg's judgments. Another one that's even more cruel is his obituary essay for Kandinsky, which is probably the meanest thing Greenberg ever wrote. Just a few weeks after Kandinsky died. And he doesn't call Kandinsky an academic artist. He calls him a provincial artist. Now, what's a provincial artist? Well, we know of one kind of provincial artist. One provincial artist is someone who lives in a small village and is unaware of advanced arts and simply paints paintings on Sunday. This is the usual kind of provincial artist we think of. But Greenberg says there's another kind. That is the artist who is really right in the thick of things, but misunderstands what is going on. And as Greenberg sees it, Kandinsky misunderstood Cubism. How so? Well, for Greenberg, what Cubism is really about is the flatness of the background medium. Right? That Cubism is fully aware that it's not presenting the illusion of three-dimensional space, but that it is winking at us and showing us that it knows that the canvas is flat by flattening everything out onto the same surface and simply depicting flat planes that show us what the object is. However, he thinks Kandinsky misunderstood Cubism to be about abstraction. And the result is that, in Greenberg's opinion, is that Kandinsky has a bunch of abstract shapes floating in academic three-dimensional space. He calls it an academic reminiscence. So you get these triangles and circles and squiggly lines and musical notation floating in this void. And he says this is actually a throwback to 19th century academic painting. He ends up saying that this is a horrible example for the younger artists. And Kandinsky may have been a great painter for a few years earlier on in his career, but it's been a disaster here at the end. So very, very harsh. All right. Now, but my main problem with Greenberg, however, is not the usual problem people have with him. The usual problem people have with Greenberg is that he's artificially cutting off artworks from their surroundings, whether they be political or otherwise. I think the real problem with Greenberg, I'm all in favor of his notion of the background, but I don't see why the background should be unarticulated. I don't think it should be one lump, the way it is for Heidegger, because then the background doesn't really perform any function. It's just this hidden, unified lump behind everything else that conditions all of the surface appearances so that individual elements of a painting simply become surfaces. There's no depth to them at all. It seems to me that the individual elements of any artwork each have their own depth. And so the artwork is less unified, as I see it, than Greenberg or even Heidegger would think. The artwork actually consists of numerous elements that are part of the work, each with its own background, each with its own depth. And you can see this, I think, easily just by looking at how people create artworks. They're adding and subtracting things up to the last minute. There's not some magical moment when finally it all comes together as a unit and we can stop. There are individual components to it. And I learned this lesson also from looking at the graffiti at Tahrir Square in Cairo. I imagine that Greenberg would have hated this art, right? He could have said that it's unaware of the flatness of the masonry background that it's painted on. It's simply, what does he call figurative art? He calls it art that tells a story. He's got a technical word that's slipping my mind right now. But he would not possibly like this art, but I find it quite haunting. What you're finding in this graffiti art at Tahrir Square is a bunch of objects floating in a kind of abstract space. It's a mixture of pharaonic objects, images of football players, images of Arabic words, hieroglyphics, all of these things mixed together and floating in a kind of non-organized space. And there's something very powerful about this. I think it's because each of the elements of the graffiti has its own depth, and these elements are always changing. People are coming and spray painting over it and putting new stuff up. So I think I'm generally in favor of the notion that artworks have a background, that artworks do not simply consist in their effect on the environment or in their political message or these sorts of things, but that there are many more backgrounds to each artwork than Greenberg or Heidegger would allow for. Now let me mention briefly, before closing, some different problems that I have with Michael Fried, who of course is often considered the intellectual heir of Greenberg. If you look at Fried's famous work on the minimalists from 1964, Arts and Objecthoods, he makes two complaints about the minimalists that I think do not go together. I think they contradict each other, though he sees them as the same. The first problem he has with them is he says that the minimalists are literalists, right? They're simply putting literal objects in our path and expecting us to consider them as artworks. And for Fried, this is impossible, because for Fried, as for Greenberg, the artwork has an autonomy. It has a depth to it that is not simply literally present in the environment, but something that cannot be exhausted or exploited. I'm willing to go along with that. I'm not willing to go along with the second step, which is where Fried says that minimalist works are also theatrical. His reason for saying this is that since they have no internal aesthetic quality, they're simply everyday objects, their only possible effect as artworks can be the rhetorical or theatrical effect they have on us. And I don't see a problem with that. And I think the problem here is that Fried is confusing two aspects of the human participation in art. I would distinguish between humans as observers and humans as ingredients, not just of art, but of other things as well. Let's talk about society first. Manuel Delanda wrote his book, A New Philosophy of Society, published it in 2006. And what Delanda says at the beginning of that book is, I'm trying to talk about society as it is in itself apart from humans. And people say, that's impossible. Humans are part of society. So how can we talk about human society as apart from humans? And Delanda says, well, obviously human beings are a part of human society. If all human beings died, there wouldn't be a human society. It does not follow from that, however, that human society simply consists in what humans think it is. Society has a real force to it. Sociologists don't know what society is, right? They keep improving sociology, trying to get closer to the reality of what society is. So humans are an ingredient in human society, but humans are not transparent observers of human society, because we can't be transparent observers of anything. Objects are always deeper than any access we can have to them. So I would draw a distinction, here's a new bit of clever terminology I've come up with, between the anthropocentric and the Anthropocene. Look at climate change. What does climate change tell us? It tells us now that the climate is Anthropocene. We're in the Anthropocene age because humans have helped create the climate as it is now. Humans are a major factor in the climate now, unlike before. It does not follow, quite the contrary, that the climate is anthropocentric. An anthropocentric climate would be that the climate is whatever we think it is. It's not. The climate could kill us all. So it's Anthropocene, it's not anthropocentric. Humans cannot understand climate down to its very depths, yet humans are an inescapable ingredient of the climate. The same with human society. There is no sociologist who can tell you exactly how society works. There will never be one, because society is very complicated, very deep and dark. There will be a continuing series of efforts to try to understand society, yet humans are an ingredient in it. And I would say the same for arts. And the reason this came to mind is because people often misunderstand what speculative realism's relation to the arts is about. People come to me and they say, well, we know you're against the human privilege in philosophy in the last 400 years, so you must be against the human privilege in art. So what would an art without humans look like? And so they try to imagine ways where we could have artworks that humans can't see or that humans won't know about. But I don't see how this is necessary. I think humans are a necessary ingredient of every artwork. It does not follow that artwork is simply its effect on humans, right? That however it affects the politics of the day or however it affects an observer. No, but we are still ingredients in the artwork. You need a human there for the artwork to be an artwork. And so therefore I think you need theater. You need theater. And this is also a way, I'll close with one last thought. This is also a reason that we can retrieve the classical sense of mimesis, which is way out of fashion, right? Because mimesis, imitation, that's considered a very old-fashioned idea of what art is about, right? That you're copying things that are in the real world. There's a different way to look at mimesis, however, which is not that you're producing copies of things in the world, but that you yourself are become the copy. The mimesis that we know from method acting, right? So you are a rock. What's your motivation? This, perhaps, is the ultimate form of mimesis in the arts. You have to become the thing. The participant is needed as an ingredient in the artwork. And this, incidentally, is why I'm not as far from Bourdieu as some people think, right? Because Bourdieu writes in non-relational aesthetics, relational aesthetics, about how the art of our day that's working well is art that forges encounters between people. They cook noodle soup packets together in the gallery, and therefore they're not alienated from each other. And I told the magazine I was going to write about Bourriaud, and they were worried. They were worried that I was going to completely trash Bourriaud. They were saying, oh, but watch out, he was really nice to you in the Taipei catalog, and you don't be too harsh on him. But actually, I ended up in praise of Bourriaud to some extent, because I think what Bourriaud comes across that's important in the idea of relational aesthetics is that the human does play some role in the work. The human is an ingredient of the work, and that's the way in which I depart from formalism. I'll leave it there. I've talked for too long. I await your questions in the gallery later. Thank you.